Everybody, we're going to go ahead and get started. My name is Sean Sloan. I'm the Director of Transportation and Infrastructure Policy at the Council of State Governments in Lexington, Kentucky. I want to welcome you to this CSG eCademy webcast on the status of federal transportation programs, state impacts, and activities. We have a lot to get to in the next hour. Here's a look at our agenda. First, we're going to get an update on where things stand with federal reauthorization of surface transportation programs and the status of the Highway Trust Fund from our friend Jung Lee at the American Association of State Highway and Transportation Officials, better known as AASHTO. Next, we're going to learn about the impact of what has been another prolonged period of uncertainty for state departments of transportation. We'll hear from someone who has been outspoken on those issues, John Schroer from the Tennessee DOT. As that uncertainty has continued at the federal level, a number of states have in recent years sought to address some of their transportation funding needs on their own. And we have two perspectives from states that have done just that. First, Senator Mike Valley will talk about the funding packages passed in South Dakota this year. And then we'll hear how Vermont raised its gas tax back in 2013 from Representative Diane Lanford. After that, we will have our presenters respond to your comments and questions. If you have a question for any of our presenters this afternoon, you can type it into the GoToWebinar panel interface at any time. We will collate those here in Lexington. I'll ask as many as we have time for at the end of the webcast. I want to bring in our first guest now. Jung Lee is the Policy Director at AASHTO in Washington. He's someone I call on frequently to provide the lay of the land about what Congress may or may not be up to with regards to transportation funding and related issues and what it all means for states. You may have seen him at one of our Transportation Policy Academies or other CSG meetings. Jung, Congress is facing a couple of key deadlines next month. What can states expect, and what do you expect to happen?
Hey, thank you, Sean, and thank you also to the broader CSG community for having me on this part of this dialogue. Really appreciate the continued partnership between AASHTO and CSG, and also really appreciate the opportunity to present alongside Commissioner John Schroer of the Tennessee DOT, who not only serves on the board of the AASHTO, leadership there, but also serves as chair of AASHTO's Standing Committee on Finance and Administration. As Sean indicated, I'm going to be talking about the federal program funding situation when it comes to transportation, especially as it relates to the condition of the Highway Trust Fund. I do have a good amount of slides given the time frame that I have. It's really meant for those of you listening in to be able to, look at the visuals perhaps even after the teleconference or the webinar. Certainly I'm not going to belabor them, and we'll go through fairly quickly. So next slide, please. So it's probably no surprise to many of you that surface transportation investment certainly hasn't been going up, and some folks say, well, maybe it has been able to keep up with inflation or at least stay flat, but the recent numbers from our colleagues at the Pew Charitable Trust show that, at all levels of government, state, federal, and local, that transportation investment actually has been in decline in real terms. Next slide, please. And, the motor fuel tax, which powers the Highway Trust Fund at the federal level to the tune of about 90% of the revenues generated, has suffered significant loss of purchasing power over the years. Again, at the federal level, we're talking about the 18.4 cent per gallon fuel tax on gasoline, and then the 24.4 cent per gallon levy on diesel fuel. When you look at something like the gas tax that hasn't been raised in 22 years at this point, and you compare to the just cost of life in general, goods and services and other critical and basic areas, as this chart shows, it's lagged substantially behind. Next slide, please. And what we're seeing is essentially a trajectory that we've been on since the late 2000s, where the Highway Trust Fund spending is persistently outpacing the monies that are coming in, again, largely based on the fuel taxes that have been stagnant in terms of, the vehicle miles traveled, but also, as I noted, the purchasing power loss. And so this structural deficit looks to continue unabated. Now, this is more of a theoretical chart in that the Highway Trust Fund, unlike the general operations in the budget of the federal government, cannot incur a deficit. So if the line at the bottom cannot be raised through new revenues to bring to the top, then the top line has to be, top red line needs to be reduced to meet the blue line on the bottom. So what we've been doing over the last 7 years or so is adding, more general fund revenues in order to plug that difference. Next slide, please. And this is just a chronicling of this continuing issue that's popping up and dogging Congress of, the Highway Trust Fund insolvency with potential to cause serious disruptions. And Congress has been able to at least patch it up at the last minute, generally in each of these circumstances, to the tune of about $62 billion now having been added to what is ostensibly a user fee financed trust fund program. Next slide, please. And the fact of the matter is that, if the current revenues do not increase, outlays, as I mentioned earlier, would have to be substantially reduced. And the way to do that is to then reduce the overall federal commitment in dollars that are provided to states for the highway capital program. We've had about a $40 billion federal aid highway program in the recent years. In order to shore up the Highway Trust Fund, again, the difference between the receipts and outlays, we estimate that you'd have to reduce the program virtually by 100%, or in this particular case, on the latest projection, about a 90% reduction in fiscal 2016. That is simply an unacceptable scenario for everyone involved. And again, that's why Congress, when facing a similar circumstance like this, has at least acted to provide last-minute general fund measures. Next slide, please. What we've done at AASHTO over the years is to at least provide kind of the technical platform of all the possible revenue sources, that could be considered by Congress to plug this structural deficit in the Highway Trust Fund, not just in the short term, but in the long run that can, support the traditional 5-6 year surface transportation bill. Our latest update is from fall of last year, and this is, again, kind of like an illustrative list where this slide and the next slide, please, shows 38 different revenue options, and this is just what we consider. There could be a slew more that are out there that could also be considered by Congress, but what it shows is that technically, all these measures are feasible to fix the trust fund today if Congress could find the political willingness to examine, and consider at least one or a series of these measures. Next slide, please. But of course, not all these measures would be able to bring the kinds of revenues needed to plug the $13 to $15 billion annual gap in the Highway Trust Fund. And, what this chart shows is that, yeah, some measures, like the more traditional ones, like fuel tax, adjustments, or something like a vehicle miles traveled fee, would go a longer way in being able to bring something like a $9,500 billion gap that we have right now for a 6-year transportation bill, but that, there is no shortage of options that are out there. Next slide, please. What we've done at AASHTO is trying to communicate the transportation investment issue in a more salient way, and this is an effort here, the infographic that we developed, and really under the stewardship of Commissioner Schroer, to be able to tell both the national transportation investment story, again, being able to relay what the Highway Trust Fund insolvency means to everyone, but also at the state level where we've asked our states, and we've got about 31, 32 of the states enlisted, to show the specific number of projects and the value of those projects and the jobs associated with those projects that would be at risk due to the Highway Trust Fund uncertainty. Next slide, please. And Commissioner Schroer obviously will go into much greater depth about his state in Tennessee, but his other peers, for example, in Georgia, Wyoming, and Arkansas, have all taken significant measures to already slow down their capital programs. And these are just some of the examples that are out there. There are even more beyond these 4 states. Next slide, please. But at the same time, there has been significant, headlines in the last couple of years, especially of various states being able to make the case at the state level to address their transportation funding shortfall by being able to pass through, fairly significant revenue measures geared for transportation investment. These include the examples that are listed here. Kind of the more typical ones you hear about is raising the per gallon excise tax of motor fuels, but being able to also direct some of the general revenues for transportation purposes. You hear about sales tax measures. Next slide, please. And you hear about, the more traditional kind of state-oriented revenue tools like the license fees and vehicle registration fees and the like. Next slide, please. And you are seeing more steps taken, especially out west, in terms of developing this mileage-based user fee or a vehicle miles traveled fee framework. Oregon certainly is the pioneer, but there is this Western-based consortium that is looking to expand what Oregon has brought to the table. Next slide, please. But what we're still at the same time careful to tell Congress is that just because states have seen some success, in being able to raise revenue measures, they are not doing it to supplant the federal program. They're only doing that to supplement the federal program. And when you look at it as, the 3 legs of a stool, just because you strengthen one of the legs, and that is the state funding leg, that doesn't mean that you can just take out that 3rd leg representing the federal program of support and still expect the program to stand. And obviously, if you look at what some folks call the devolution measure to eliminate the federal program or significantly roll it back, you're going to really, put interstate commerce and national security and defense at risk. Next slide, please. What our friends at the American Road and Transportation Builders Association also provided is recently, for one of the devolution proposals called the T Act, or the Transportation Empowerment Act, if you were to roll back the 18.4 cent federal gas tax, this is the amount of fuel tax revenues that would have to be increased, or the fuel tax rates that would have to be increased on the state gas taxes around the country. And this would be just to be able to stand still. You're not going to get any more money than you do right now if you're in a given state in terms of that federal support. And obviously, the numbers are fairly eye-popping, especially for some of the states like, Alaska and D.C., but also you look at, states like Wyoming and California, that's well above the 18.4 cent per gallon level. Next slide, please. So what we're doing now is just looking at the calendar, what can we expect going forward? And, the May 31st deadline is obviously the most critical one coming up when the current extension of the MAP 21 legislation expires. The Highway Trust Fund's authority to expend dollars also expires at that time. And next slide, please. There have been a number of congressional proposals that have come up in the last few months. Most recent one is looking at, hey, how about, indexing the fuel tax, coming up with a commission that would force Congress to act on the Highway Trust Fund revenue gap there over a 3-year period. If there's no action, then fuel taxes will increase to meet the Highway Trust Fund outlays. The notable thing about this is the strong Republican presence in sponsoring this type of approach led by Congressman Renacci of Ohio. There have also been kind of the traditional, well, why don't we look at increasing the gas tax as represented by Representative Blumenauer from Oregon. The Obama administration has talked about mandatory repatriation of corporate earnings sitting overseas to provide a 6-year funding support to the next transportation bill. Next slide, please. There has also been the voluntary repatriation of corporate earnings overseas as examined by Senators Boxer and Paul, and also to some extent by Congressman Delaney and Hanna of looking at that whole repatriation of corporate earnings directed towards infrastructure framework that actually started in the last Congress. Next slide, please. And then you've also seen some of the more short-term, quote-unquote, K4s to, to account for the $10.8 billion short-term patch that was passed by Congress last summer, and we're running into a similar situation there. So there have been a number of these proposals that are all at the table. There hasn't been much movement really on any of them, especially in the context of a long-term bill. So where Congress is sitting now is facing a few options where it all really pertains to, just how long of a short-term extension will they consider. So if you look at kind of the shortest patch that would be looked at after May 31st, you're looking at something that goes till end of July, and that would, the thinking behind that approach would be that there would be no additional general fund, transfers to the Highway Trust Fund that would be needed based on the current Highway Trust Fund balance forecast as provided by the U.S. Department of Transportation. But of course, that would expect also that there would be a light at the end of the tunnel in terms of a long-term bill, because otherwise you would just have to kick the can again come end of July and really significantly risk the summer construction seasons that many of the state DOTs rely on. Another option could be to extend the MAP 21 program to end of the federal fiscal year at the end of September or the end of 2015 calendar year. That obviously would buy Congress more time, but that would then require some level of general fund transfers to the tune of about probably $3 to $7 billion range. And you'd still be in that dynamic where you want to see some light at the end of the tunnel towards a 6-year bill. Another option could be that you really kick the can down the road to, say, pass the presidential elections at the end of calendar year 2016. Obviously, the amount of general fund transfers for something like that would be even greater, and you would really be kind of, washing your hands off of the transportation funding challenge for some foreseeable future. And then, of course, how the long-term bill prospects look at that point in time is, anybody's guess. So we're really coming up on the crunch time here, and this is, only exacerbating the challenges the state DOTs are going through in being able to manage their very significant and critical capital improvement programs. And so at this time, I'd like to turn it over to Commissioner Schroer to tell that compelling story from Tennessee.
Yeah, John, first of all, thank you so much, and please do stay with us, and I'm sure folks may have questions for you at the end of the webcast. And as I said at the top, if you do have questions for John or any of our presenters, you may enter them into the GoToWebinar interface at any time. And we do want to bring in Commissioner Schroer now. He is the Commissioner of the Tennessee Department of Transportation and someone who is very active in AASHTO, as John mentioned. He's also Vice Chair this year of our CSG Transportation Public Policy Committee. And Commissioner, as I said at the top, you've been very vocal about the impact that this short-term kick-the-can approach in Congress has had for your state and the transportation projects you've been able to move forward with. What can you tell us about that?
Well, good afternoon, everybody. Appreciate being here. I always I hate following John because he knows so much about this, and he always makes me look bad. But Tennessee has to look at things a little differently than most of the other states because we are a pay-as-you-go state, and which means we have no transportation debt at all in our portfolio, and there are only 4 other states like that. And so it makes a difference for us because a lot of states are simply have the ability to go through a short-term funding crisis by using leverage to get through. We do not have that option and don't choose to have that option, quite frankly. So it's something that we do by choice, and we're happy with that position. But what we noticed several years ago was that we knew that MAP 21 was going to run out. We knew that funding was an issue. We knew that there had been in the past I think 9 extensions on safety leave, and we looked at what would happen if the federal government decided not to add money into the trust fund, and how that would affect us. And so what we realized is that we needed to be in a very strong cash position in order to withstand any shortfall that we would get funding from the federal government. So we started going into our options of how to raise cash, and what we realized very quickly is that the best way for us to raise cash is to not let as many projects out. And so last year we went through a pretty thorough process to look at our backlog for our 3-year building program, and we picked projects across the state that would enable us to that by not letting those contracts, we would able to push back to a different fiscal year, and it would help our cash position. So that's really kind of what we have done. And so we have, and I need to use the word pushback, not cancel. We've pushed back 33 projects to the tune of about $400 million. And we plan on, if something is passed on May 31st, and there's funding attributed to that, then we would let those projects go between July 1st and September 30th. But if not, we then will be in a position to pay for the construction that's currently underway. We've got about $2.4 billion under construction at the moment. My program, just so you know, is I've got about a $1.8 billion budget. About 55% of it comes from federal, 45% from state. So it's a medium-sized program, about the 16th or 17th largest in the nation. And we are working hard to make sure that we maintain what we have first. And I think the important thing is that we, in the first 6 months of the federal fiscal year, the projects that we let were basically all maintenance projects, some bridges work, but all of our pavement contracts, everything that we knew that we had obligation authority for, that we let in the first 6 months, so that we knew we'd have money to complete our maintenance program. We are a fix-it-first state. We want to make sure that the assets that we have are well maintained, and we do that before we build any new capacity, and which is why the projects which we push back were all capacity projects, not maintenance projects. So it created a little bit of there were some people that were upset, mainly the elected officials. We have done a survey in our state, and we surveyed regular everyday people and elected officials and other people, and we found out that the everyday people were much more concerned about the maintenance of existing roads than they were about the construction of new roads. And lo and behold, we found out that the elected officials were more interested in the construction of new roads than they were with the maintenance of the old roads. I don't know if that has anything to do with maybe ribbon cuttings and other things, but we listened wholeheartedly to that and made sure that maintenance of our existing facilities were the most important. That creates a double-edged sword for us in Tennessee. Our roads are consistently ranked in the top 5 in the nation. And because of that, our elected officials don't get a lot of calls or complaints about the quality of our roads. And so often, the funding for additional revenue from a state standpoint, even from our officials in Washington, they're not getting the push from the people in Tennessee as that might happen in other states. So at the moment, we do not have a plan in place to raise additional revenue, though I have had numerous conversations with the governor, and he is looking at that option in the next year or two. We are faced with the same issue that every state is faced with, and that's declining revenues, increased asset base, and a deterioration of our current assets. And we also are a state that has a significant amount of interstates that go through it, about 1,000 miles of interstates in our state. We have I-40 and I-65 and I-24 and I-75 and I-81, and so a lot of people are passing through our states, and we're having to maintain the roads, and so that is putting a strain on our state dollars as well, and our ability to match our federal dollars that goes along with that. We are hoping for a long-term bill, like everybody is. Everybody talks about it. I don't see a whole lot of. I'm not very encouraged that we will get one of those anytime soon. I don't necessarily believe that the repatriation of tax dollars will work on a voluntary standpoint, and I don't think it get passed on a mandatory standpoint. I'm not sure how much money that will create, especially if it's voluntary. And it's also, quite frankly, still a short-term fix. It's time, in my opinion, that Congress looks at a long-term fix is not a fix that provides funding for a 5-year period, in my mind. It is a fix that provides for funding that is sustainable for the years to come, so that we in the transportation business can do our planning, our long-range plans, and our 10 or 15-year forecasts to make sure that that works. I do want to say, and then I'll conclude, is that every year we produce a 3-year building program, and the first year is the projects that we pretty much guarantee to our elected officials that we will complete those projects, and the second and third year are just tentative. We presented our 3-year building program 2 weeks ago to our legislators, and much to their dismay, it only had 2 new projects involved in it, and one was a economic development project to improve an interchange for a big tire manufacturing facility. The other one is just to finish the paving on a construction project that had started a couple of years ago. The rest of the projects were the projects that we had pushed back into this fiscal year from last fiscal year. So we simply just took the previous year's building program, shifted everything back a year, and added 2 projects to it. So we basically have been in a stagnant position with regard to new projects. It is something that has gotten a lot of attention. We are very concerned about staying out of debt and being fiscally sound. The state of Tennessee has the least amount of debt per capita than any state in the nation. We're very proud of that. We're a very conservative state, and we operate that way financially. So we're hoping something happens. In the meantime, we're well prepared to withstand whatever goes on, not that we like it, but we're able to withstand that without borrowing any money or stopping any construction projects, and we're comfortable in that position. So we're happy with that, and I think with that I think that absolutely is exactly 10 minutes, which is what I was given. So I will turn it back over to moderator.
Thank you so much, Commissioner, and please stay with us, and we'll see if folks have questions for you at the end. If you do have a question for the Commissioner or anyone else today, please type it into the GoToWebinar interface, and we will ask as many as time allows at the end of the hour. We're going to move now to Senator Mike Valley. He is the chairman of the South Dakota Senate Transportation Committee. He's also one of the co-chairs of our CSG Transportation Public Policy Committee. Senator, South Dakota is one of 5 states so far this year that has addressed transportation funding in a major way. What did you all come up with, and how did it come together?
Well, thank you, Sean, and really appreciate the opportunity here. I think what I'll do is I'll just set the tone first, as to what kind of state we are and how we got started in this. Number one, our legislature held a 2/3 majority in the Republican aisle. In both the House and the Senate, we have a Republican governor. However, we're a very, very conservative state, and our Republican Party ranges all the way from several in the Tea Party to some that are, you know, a lot more, let's say, liberal in that sense. So that gives you an idea of the makeup of our body. No general funds are used for transportation and roads at all, $0. Any money that does come from the road does have to go back to the road. So we can't, by Constitution, we can't use any gas tax for education or anything else. We're in what we call a preservation mode. There's no new projects. Everything is preserved what we've got. The Transportation Commission makes the decision on what projects to do. The legislature is completely out of that decision-making process. I would say I talk about our road system that's under the state jurisdiction at about $16 billion asset. I started this about 7 years ago. I lost a vote by 3 votes in the Senate 7 years ago, and then the recession came and all else kind of things changed. So if you'll put up that, yeah, I've got the slide there now. The first thing I would say that if I'm going to sell this package and I was going to give you what we did and what led to our success, if you can pick up something from this and use it, fine. I'm just going to tell you how we did it. First of all, we have summer studies here, and I got a bipartisan road funding task force. And we met we had 6 regional meetings. I took it on the road. I went all the way around the state and had regional meetings in 6 major communities, and then, of course, in the capital in Pierre was the 7th community. We had about 120 people that testified, and probably 120 at each meeting, but those that got up and actually testified, there was about 120 votes. I think out of that we had 2 that said we didn't need to do anything. The second thing I'd say you need to do is you got to have an alliance of interest groups. And I'll show you a slide of all that, and I'm not going to go through it, but it'll give you an idea. Got everyone that we possibly could, from the Chamber of Commerce's to the ag groups to everyone involved. The third thing was the governor had to get him and the Department of Transportation on our side. And I had a bill 4 years ago. Four years ago, and he would not support it. And I knew if I didn't have his support at that particular time, I ended up 3 votes short. So anyway, those are the 3 main things. The fourth thing you got to do is you got to take it on the road. I spoke to every Rotary, Lions Club, media outlet, Chamber of Commerce, anyone that would let me talk to them and explain our position. Next slide. That just shows you the list of the different people that joined a group called Roads Are Vital. We had support from other groups, but they didn't want to be in this Roads Are Vital coalition. But that just gives you an idea of all the different groups that we had, from the auto dealers to the Petroleum Institute to the concrete people to the agriculture people to each individual city. Next slide. What we learned from that study that we took on the road, we had, after we had those regional meetings, we had another, I think, 6 other meetings in Pierre, the capital, and we went through, we peeled that onion back to as low as we could and then built on it. We have about $55 billion worth of goods that are shipped into and out of South Dakota a year, and I'm not going to go through that whole list, but it kind of gives you an idea of the things that we try to explain and what we learned from it. Our number 1 and 2 industries in this state are agriculture and tourism, and they're highly dependent upon roads, and people understand that. And we're like everyone else. We've got a deteriorating asset. Next slide. I'm going to go through these slides quick. It just gives you an idea of some of the things I used when I went to these various groups, and I went to legislators, a lot of them in person and a lot of them in committee meetings. This is just a functional classification of the roads that we have and the mileage we have. We have 83,000 miles of roads in South Dakota. That's including the local and the state roads. That's about 3 1/3 times around the world at the equator. If you look at the right-hand pie, that's the state highways. That's about 8,850 miles, and those include our interstate and our state roads. The next slide talks about who travels on those roads. And the state roads, if you look down there in the bottom on the left pie chart, about a little over 2/3 of our traffic is on our state roads. County has about 14%, township about 3%, and then there's other roads in there. Municipal has 14%. So that gives you the vehicle mile traveled. The interesting one is that the pie next to it is we're an agriculture state, but 80% of the heavy truck traffic is on our state roads. So it made people realize we need to keep up that asset. The next slide, just so people have an idea of how many vehicles we have. So if we want to tax the vehicles of somebody, how many we've got about 1 million motorized vehicles. And that just gives you a chart of how many vehicles we've got. And there's trailers. We've got about 1.2 million and about 200,000 trailers. So that just gives you an idea. And then I put down the right-hand part how many hybrid and electric vehicles we had. Next slide. This one I tried to give people an idea of where we get our money. This is where we get our money for our roads. The federal government is part of it, our state motor fuels, our vehicle excise tax, the county's property tax, what they put into it, the vehicle license plate fees, and the wheel tax. That gives you an idea of where the revenue comes in. Next slide. Then I wanted to show them what's going to happen to our federal money when the end of the year comes by, and that's an older chart there, but it shows the July, August when it was supposed to go out last August. Now it's in May. Next slide. This shows our gas tax, and the last time we raised it was in 1999. We raised it to 22 cents. If we would have kept up with inflation today, that 22 cents would have had to be 45 cents. And if you look at on the bottom part of that chart, that means that 22 cents now buys 10.9 cents worth of roads, goods, and services. Next slide. So what I tried to tell people then was, all right, so now we're giving you all this money, DOT. Are you doing anything with it? I mean, are you being frugal with our money? This chart just shows, compared to the other states that are surrounding us, how many miles we get per employee. And as you can see, South Dakota gets more miles per DOT employee than all our neighbors. Next slide. The next one shows what our roadway maintenance cost is per mile compared to our neighbors. And you see North Dakota beat us out, but we're next in line compared to South Dakota. North Dakota, I mean Wisconsin, Wyoming, Nebraska, Montana, Iowa, Minnesota, and Colorado. So that kind of gives you an idea. I had several other slides that shows this type of thing, but what I'm trying to get people to understand is that they're doing a pretty good job with the money we're giving them. Next slide. If I had one slide, this would be the slide that I would show. This shows where we're at on the pie on the left-hand side. That's where we're at today on the condition of our roads. A sec here. I got to flip my chart here so I can look at it. That left-hand chart, if you look at it, we're really sitting pretty good. And that's a consequence of the stimulus money came. And we put that to really good use. You can see we've only got 2% poor and 9% fair. And I always look at that because when they're poor, you got to dig them up and start over, and fair is going to roll over into it. So everybody says, what's the problem, Valley? I says, look at what happens in 10 years. At the current funding that we have now from the feds and the state, we are at 25% poor and 27% fair. That means over half our roads are in poor or fair condition. And everybody, that kind of was a startler for most people. I said, that's it. That's if we just don't raise any taxes at all. So what we decided to do was put up a dashboard. I'm big on goals, and I want to have a goal out there. And so that's what we did. We came up with this goal that we want to have 5% poor, 15% fair, 50% good, and 30% excellent. Next slide. That shows you we would need 100 and that dashboard indicator. That's just what we went over. I'm sorry. Next slide. that shows that we'd need 143 million bucks. Now we all looked at each other and said, that's not going to happen. So we had to go back and look at, all right, next slide. What's our maintenance cost? And you can see when I explain this that, you know, if the road is in excellent condition, it doesn't cost much to keep it up. But if it gets to fair and poor, it costs you a lot more. Now you look at the slide we're looking at now is the future pavement conditions, and it shows where that red in 2014 and where it's going to be in 2023, and that's going from 2% to 25% poor. The same thing with the yellow on the fair. Okay, next slide. Now we went to the county roads. That was all state. We asked the counties to assess their roads. What's interesting here is you look at the left-hand one, it shows that nearly 70% of the oil roads that are county are in fair or poor condition or failing. The gravel roads, it's about the same condition that we're going to be with our state roads in 10 years. About half are in fair or poor. So then we said, let's look at the bridges. Next slide. The bridges, every state probably has the same empirical data on that, because every other year, every 2 years, any bridge over 20 feet has got to be inspected. And so I was able to show, if you look at the right-hand side, the county structures, we have 28% structurally deficient and 3% functionally obsolete. So I said, you're driving out in the country, a third of the bridges you got a problem with. If you're driving with your car, you're probably okay. You're carrying something in your pickup, you better be looking at what the load limit is. Next slide. You know, you don't get very many heartstrings to pull on roads. It's a pretty, you know, mundane, not sexy issue. That bridge on the top right-hand side, the last vehicle over that bridge was a school bus with kids on it. The story is, and I won't get into it long, but the mom calls up and said, that bridge don't look right. Called her commissioner. He comes out and looks at it. The semi is coming to go across it pulling a pup. He talks that pup into backing up, and as he walks back across that bridge to get to his pickup, it failed. That's how close it was. That was supposed to be replaced that summer. Next slide. And then I did just, here's what it is. We've got 1,045 structures to be replaced, 230,000 a structure. And the rural area, a lot of times you can place a bridge with culverts, so that's why those numbers are that way. That's $250,000. We looked at each other and said, that's not happening either. So we had to come up with something. Next slide. That just shows what our total net there to crack was. If you look at the left-hand side, $258 million is what was the need that was determined. Not to make everything perfect, but to get us back to where we wanted to set that goal at. Here's what happened is on the right-hand side, we got $68 million for the state roads, and locals got about 19.8. However, we gave the locals the option to raise other taxes, wheel tax and property taxes, and that amounted to about $85 million. But that's up to each individual county because we're talking local control. Next slide. Here's the things that we did, and I'm going to go through these real quick. First thing, we set up a local bridge improvement grant fund. In order to get to that fund, though, every county has to have a 5-year plan. If they don't have a 5-year plan, I'm sorry, you can't get into the fund. Then we allocated $7 million to go into that, plus another about another $9 million to go into that fund from the license plate increases. So we increased license plate fees by 20%. We increased the motor vehicle excise tax by 1%, from 3% to 4 cents. We raised the motor fuel tax 6 cents a gallon, and we got into that. I was trying to get more, and finally I compromised. And that we put an emergency clause on it, and we started it at the end of the month. We taxed ethanol. We had the registration fees on license plates as 20%. We also increased the fees on agriculture vehicles that are over 20 tons. We increased for the locals the amount of property tax that they could tax based on the size of the valuation in their community. We did the same thing with the townships. We increased the wheel tax, which is at $4 a wheel. They can now go to $5, but it's a local option that goes to the counties. And we also gave them the ability to tax 12 wheels rather than just 4. some things get tacked along as you're going into this deal. Had to make some compromises. We moved up the speed limit from 75 to 80 mile an hour, and we did took out some inventory tax. That's what we end up doing. Next slide. This gives you a comparison, and I use this a lot as to what our surrounding states have. South Dakota is what we were at. We're now at 28 cents effective April 1. And our license plate fees went up 20%, and the excise tax went to 4%. And our license plate fees, obviously, that's on a 2013, I think, Ford 150. Next slide, and I'm done. This is what I ended every one of my presentations. If you got it, a road brought it. Not much is parachuted in. That's my story, and it just takes a lot of salesmanship. It had to be bipartisan because I lost a lot of people that said I signed a no tax pledge, so we had to get Democrats and Republicans. So it was very much bipartisan, and we had to get a lot of groups involved. So that's how we did it.
Thanks, Senator, for your remarks as well, and please stay with us. If you have a question for Senator Valley, you may enter it into the GoToWebinar interface, and we will ask it at the end of today's webcast. Our final presenter this afternoon is Representative Diane Lanfer of Vermont. She is the other co-chair of our CSG Transportation Public Policy Committee, and she was in the legislature back in 2013 when Vermont lawmakers passed a gas tax increase there. Vermont was one of 6 states that passed transportation funding overhauls that year, and 2015 appears certain to rival that. Representative Lanfer, you sent us some slides as well. What can you tell us about how the gas tax increase came about in 2013?
Well, thank you, Sean, and I'd like to thank everybody who's participating in this webinar, and it's always great to hear the good senator get so excited. I get totally mesmerized by his presentation. So, I served many years on the Vermont House Transportation Committee, and currently I'm actually serving on the House Appropriations Committee, but a little bit of a change, but I'm still very much involved in the transportation world. So if we can just start with the first slide there. Great, and this is I've got about 4 slides to describe to you what Vermont did most recently with the gas tax and funding. Vermont has experienced a decline in gasoline consumption, like most states, and thus a decline in our revenue. I noticed that the good senator had, on one of his slides, had South Dakota at 9 billion miles a year for vehicle miles traveled. And you might find it interesting, I don't have it on the slides, but that Vermont, on an average, is about 7 billion miles a year on our roads. A little bit smaller state, but we travel a great deal here. So the decline in Vermont's revenue became actually quite critical when, in 2012, Vermont was at risk of actually returning $56 million in federal funds because we could not fully match those funds with the needed state dollars. And what happened after that was we much like South Dakota, we actually had a summer study that was appointed to examine this issue, and I served on that summer study that year. In the past, it might be worth noting that past studies in 2008 resulted in action in Vermont in 2009 when we created the Transportation Infrastructure Bond Fund. That's for another topic, but we did have some action taken in 2009 as well. Because the fixed cents per gallon gasoline tax revenue was so anemic, we made a gasoline assessment equal to 2% on the retail price and 2 cents on the diesel. Because of complications with IFTA, the International Fuel Tax Agreement, we could not put a percentage on diesel. Now, the new 2012 analysis defined the gap relative to projected revenues as opposed to past spending, and is more comprehensive, including rail and public transit capital needs, but is otherwise comparable to the basic approach that we took in 2008. The study concluded that Vermont faced an annual $240 million gap Now, this is considerable for us because our annual base budget is approximately $550 million. Now, obviously, next slide, we were not going to even try to attempt to get to the $240 million mark, but it was very good to know what the gap was if we wanted to get to just a state of good repair. But we remained disciplined to wanting to just address the gap to make sure that we did not leave any federal money on the table. So here we have a slide, the legislative response to this issue. Well, compared to the scale of the problem, what we have been able to achieve in Vermont is rather modest. The Vermont legislature received an expanded report on transportation funding options in January of 2013, and that was the start of our session. The continued decline in gasoline sales and the prospect of declining federal revenues generated support for additional revenue measures. And like the presenter before me, there's a lot of hitting the road and meeting with constituents and meeting with groups and really getting the community to understand why we need to do, why we're proposing what we were going to propose to do in the coming year. So we increased and this time in 2013 restructured our gasoline tax so that it is roughly a half fixed cent per gallon and half price-based. Really try to stabilize one direction or the other. We also started the process of examining how different alternative fuels, primarily natural gas and electric, could be taxed with the revenues going to the transportation fund. The result in 2013 was the approval of a 2-year phased-in change. This, over 2 years, we brought in a new 4% assessment on the price of gasoline while simultaneously decreasing the per gallon tax by 6.9 cents. A floor price was established to ensure that the revenues could not fall substantially if the price of gasoline dropped. And a ceiling was established to protect consumers if price dramatically escalates. And that was really, really an important piece in this, that we wanted to hit that right balance. And just as a side note, in 2009, in the TIB, that Transportation Infrastructure Bond, we did not put a floor. And we're actually paying the price for that right now. And there's consideration in the Senate, actually, as we speak, on actually putting a floor on that. But I don't know if that'll pass this year. Well, these actions actually did help to stabilize our revenues to some degree. Now, I've heard others speak about, we've got a bipartisan here. We actually passed one tax package in 2009 with a Republican governor, and the second one with a Democratic governor. So I guess we're all on the same page when it comes to that. Next slide, please. Great. Now, this is a very helpful slide for us. It just really demonstrates where we were in the gas status before the changes in FY13, and then that phased two-year process, and what happened at the gas pumps if you were looking at it from our revenue for 7/1/14 of this year. So this slide is very helpful in comparing the status of gasoline before and after the legislative inaction, or action, not inaction, happened. So if you want to take a look at that, where before we were at 19 cents per gallon at the per gallon cents, now we're at, in the below graph, we're at 12. Now, I don't know if other states have this, but the petroleum cleanup fee of 1 cent per gallon, which stayed the same, we didn't make a change there. That is used for if there's underground tanks that are found or that are out there in the environment, if you, on a construction site or someone has a gas station that needs to have those underground tanks removed, we actually have this fund created to help any of those discovered tanks or leaking tanks be removed. And I can imagine that there would be, in the past, if you found a tank like that, the expense of having it removed and the environmental cleanup was prohibitive from someone wanting to bring that forward. So this fund is actually there for that cleanup cost. The next is the TIB, which is that Transportation Infrastructure Bond Assessment that we passed in 2009, 2% on the retail price. And then in the bottom slide, you'll see our new T-fund assessment. There's your 4 cents. So it gives you a good picture of where we were before and after. So at the bottom, our total state and federal levies was 38 cents per gallon plus the 2% in 2013. And now you see that we're at 31.5 cents per gallon plus the 4% plus the 2% TIB. Now it's really hard to kind of predict because the percentage is based on the price, so therefore that fluctuates. And but to give you an idea of what that means, if you took all of that together, we're at 51 cents per gallon. That's including the federal. Okay, next slide, please. And this is what we did around diesel. Not exactly the most exciting slide, but it shows you the before and after, and there was 3 cents. So overall, the effect of changes that Vermont has made has been very positive. The T-fund revenue prior to the TIB peaked in 2009 at $223 million, then really collapsed in 2009 during the Great Recession to $203 million. So in FY10, the first year of the TIB, the transportation fund plus the TIB was at $228 million in state dollars, and this has grown every year since. The growth rate from FY10 through 14 has been pretty healthy at a 4.7% rate per year, and but since that growth, it's slowed. The forecast for FY16 and 20 is getting close to anemic again at 1.1% growth. So our declining consumption, reduced in both miles traveled and efficient gas mileage, continues to contribute to our lost revenue. Looking into the future, Vermont is very concerned about, the federal reductions for Vermont in both the formula funding and the overall federal appropriation dollars. We also have a commitment to addressing an emissions problem in our air quality, and that will continue to erode our revenues. So going into the future, one of the biggest questions that I have going out there is going to be users of the transportation system. Who are they? And as we consider new ways to sustainably fund our nation's transportation system, we will need to redefine the users of the system, what exactly is their fair share to the transportation system, and how is that cost going to be collected. And with that, I think I end almost on time. All right, thank you.
Thank you so much, Representative, and thanks again to all of our guests this afternoon. We have just a little bit of time for Q&A here. If you do have a last-minute question, and you can enter that into the GoToWebinar interface on your computer screen, and I'll direct it to the appropriate person. I did want to just go back to Jung Lee and get his impressions on what he's heard from our other speakers. Jung, how do South Dakota and Vermont fit into the overall landscape of what states are doing on transportation funding? And then, is anything Congress is talking about likely to make life easier for folks like Commissioner Schroer?
Thanks for the question. Certainly what really resonates to the decision makers on Capitol Hill here in Washington, D.C. is what's actually happening on the ground as it relates to, the leaders of the states being able to actually take action to address their transportation investment needs. One of the, consistent challenges to explain the importance of the federal program is its relatability to the driving public and other, travelers that use the system, that, this is a program that is gargantuan in size relative to the various, state-level budgets, but it's hard to explain, what is the value proposition here in that, how much of their hard-earned dollars go to support this federal program, and what do they get back for it in return, and what's going on at the state levels, in Tennessee, in South Dakota, in Vermont, being able to really show those tangible achievements of these are the types of projects that have been able to provide the mobility benefits. I mean, that's really the most important part. And what we've also been telling our leaders at the state DOTs that we serve at AASHTO is, the day-to-day staff based here in D.C. can go up the Hill and urge action on the Highway Trust Fund, 10 times a day. But it's really the message from the leaders at the states and at the state DOTs specifically in our case that really carry the weight 10 times more than anything that myself or other folks here at AASHTO can do, because they recognize from the Hill, both the members and the staff, that people at AASHTO get paid to talk about this stuff. But it's really the volunteers that lead organizations like CSG and AASHTO that are taking time out of their very busy schedule to, actually come out to D.C. or, in their own districts to meet with the congressional leaders and talk about the importance of this issue. This is something that we've asked every, state in our membership to do, and certainly, Commissioner Schroer really has been a very vocal voice to that effort, and we're hopeful that, we are going to be able to see resolution to this issue in the form of a long-term bill.
Great. Thank you. Well, we have just about run out of time this afternoon. We promised to keep it to an hour. And so I want to thank our guests again, and thanks to everyone who tuned in today. This webinar will be archived in the CSG Knowledge Center, so if you missed any part of it, you can listen again or send a link to a friend. That'll be up on our website in a few days. Be sure to keep an eye on csg.org to find out about future events in the eCademy series, not only on transportation, but on all our policy areas. I'm Sean Sloan at CSG headquarters in Lexington. Have a good afternoon.